The first question that looms over all others: did World War II end in the way that people had imagined, or particularly, did the winning side gain their objectives? If those objectives are defined in one particular manner, the answer is no, and another yes. Let's look at the failures of the Allied causes. World War I had promised us a perpetual peace. The Versailles Treaty was a way to make sure that the war would end all other wars, and it failed. The League of Nations failed. In World War II, there was an optimism that the Allies were fighting for the four freedoms, or they were fighting for the Atlantic Charter, or that they were going to rehabilitate Joseph Stalin, and the Soviet Union would be a partner, and they would have so much power, these three powerful nations, that they could adjudicate the post-war world in a positive sense. So then World War II would sort of be the real war to end all wars. At least that was the idea of the UN Charter. That, of course, was a failure. More people have been killed in wars since World War II than the 65 million who perished in that terrible 6-year period. The United Nations, while some may argue is an improvement on the League of Nations by fact that it still exists in the way the League of Nations became obsolete and was ended by World War II, has not been able to either provide a moral or ethical model for governance on a global scale, much less has it been able to stop wars from breaking out or ending them when they do break out. It is not a coalition of democratic nations. It is a coalition of often authoritarian governments in which true democracies are in the minority. And many of its resolutions hardly are what we would call classically liberal. They're mean-spirited, they're punitive, and they're counterproductive. So the United Nations, if that was the purpose of World War II, is to make a perfect peace, that failed. If the purpose of World War II was to end authoritarianism, especially totalitarianism, then it failed. Because think of it this way: Britain declared war on Germany on September 2nd, 1939, to preserve the freedom of Poland. And that is to stop German totalitarianism from absorbing Poland in the way that it had absorbed Czechoslovakia and in the way that it had undermined nations like Romania and Hungary. World War II ended by turning those countries over to the Soviet Union. And so we substituted, if I could be so general and so sloppy in terminology, we substituted a right-wing totalitarianism for a left-wing totalitarianism. In terms of blood on one's hands, Stalin, who had been knee-deep in the collectivizations of the 1920s, the show trials, the execution of the Russian military classes, of Polish civilians, he had more blood on his hands than Hitler did. And yet, World War II ensured that the Soviet Union would now control Eastern Europe. That was not the objective. And so in that way, World War II failed again. If the objective of World War II, however, on the other hand, was to stop Nazi Germany, to stop Italian fascism, and to stop Japanese militarism, and to prevent them from killing millions of people, it sort of failed too, at least in the sense that it only stopped them after 50 to 55 million Chinese, Russians, Eastern Europeans, and Western Europeans had died. In other words, given the power of the Soviet Union that was displayed during the war, and the power of the British Empire, and the power of the United States, one asks, why couldn't that power have been expressed earlier in 1938, 39, 40, and it would have precluded the Axis head start, or at least their ability to kill so many unarmed people. Had the United States had the military power that it had in 1943, in 1939, had Britain had the power it displayed in 44, had it had that in 36, maybe we wouldn't have had place names like Belsen or Treblinka or Auschwitz. Maybe 6 million Jews would be alive today because the Third Reich wouldn't have dared try to start a war with such powerful allies. In that sense, the agendas of World War II were a failure. But that said, if the agenda was to stop a costly mistake, that is, that prior European appeasement, prior American isolationism, prior Russian collusion out of naivete, self-interest, selfishness, laxity, any term you want to use might apply to the attitudes of the Allies prior to the war. Despite all that, if they finally wised up, in the case of Britain in 39, in the case of the United States in 41, in the case of the Soviet Union in 41, and they saw that they were facing an existential threat in fascism and Nazism and Japanese militarism, and an existential threat that had a head start, and the purpose was to stop that, then World War II was a success. And remember how close they came to failing.